Welcome, good afternoon. My name is Lamar Walker, and I'm the member of the Jewish Community Relations Council in Atlanta. On behalf of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, JCPA, I would like to welcome you to this webinar on what it is like to be a Jew and Black at this moment. JCPA is the national hub of the Jewish Community Relations Network, made up of 125 local community relation councils and 16 national Jewish agencies. JCPA brings the network together to grapple with and build consensus on pressing issues of the day. JCPA is the engine that powers the Jewish community's work on civil rights, radical justice, and criminal justice reform. As part of the response to the grievous murder of George Floyd, JCPA made a pledge to work even harder to end systemic racism in the US, particularly in policying, and also to work to make our own institutions more welcoming and inclusive. This webinar is part of that effort. Today we have two guests. Ms. Ilana, if you can introduce yourself, if you don't mind.
Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Ilana Kaufman. I am based in Berkeley, California, and I'm the Executive Director of the Jews of Color Initiative. And it's great to be here. Thanks to JCPA and Yavilah and Lamar. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. Yavilah, if you don't mind.
Hi, I'm Yavilah McCoy. I'm the CEO of Dimensions Educational Consulting. I'm a racial equity practitioner. I'm a guide in helping people to recover the deepest sense of their humanity in relationship. I work in Dimensions with 4 other Black women and 1 white Jewish woman on building multiracial equity in community. We provide educational resources for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we provide community development that empower Jews of color and people of color in leadership.
Ilana, what is it that you do in the community?
Our work at the Jews of Color Initiative is focused on 3 things. We run the nation's only philanthropic fund focused on building out the field of organizational and leadership development for Jewish people of color. So we make grants, and we invest in things like leadership development, grassroots networking, cohort building, research, all of the things that are helpful in supporting Jews of color, in being centered in our work, being in a space where we have both tools and resources and can help both self-advocate and reimagine the Jewish world as it already is and as we want it to further become. We focus on research in the community and we do education. I work with a terrific team, and our work is really about sitting at the center of racial equity, racial justice, the Jewish community, and the way philanthropy can help transform the history of who we have been told we are to who we truly are.
Awesome. Yavilah, do you have anything else to add as far as what it is that you do in the community?
Well, I mean, because the call is titled Black Lives Matter and, Black Jews, in conversation with Black Jews, I do want to lift up that, we make Black Lives Matter by investing in Jews of color and people of color directly. For us, Black Lives Matter and their model is a grassroots-led community organizing and empowerment model. And we've borrowed from that in the ways in which we've been empowering Jews of color. And we invest in Black, Brown, and Indigenous people having a say in what equity needs to mean for them as we grow justice in this country. So we understand real clear in the context of our work that Jews of color need to be built into the decision-making guides that evoke consideration of what equity is. We want to create spaces where we don't create exclusive stakeholder spaces that don't hear Jews of color voices. We make sure that we empower people on the ground who are on the front lines of issues through our work. And we aim to address the ways in which when we make decisions, articulate problems, and come up with answers that meet real needs. The people who are directly targeted by those needs have to be at the front of policymaking, have to be at the front of decision-making, not being approached afterward to sign off on policies and strategies that were created in rooms without them. So that's what we do when we're supporting people through educational resources, and that's what we do when we're supporting people through our community development programs.
As for the audience, if you have any questions at any point in time, you can add the questions in the question box on your screen. At any point in time you have any questions, feel free to put them in that question box. So, Ilana, what do you? Why is this so important? Why is this so important that we do this work in the community? That both the Lives Matter community, both the Jewish community. What makes these efforts so important?
I mean, these efforts are so important because at a minimum, 12 to 15% of the US Jewish community are people of color. Black, brown, Asian, Latinx, multiracial, Native. And this population is always only growing. And this population is within a US context where Jews are just 2.2% of the population. And this country, the blessing of this country, the magic of this country is that we are designed to be a multiracial country. And so any environment in which there are only white folks or only people of color is an artifact of segregation. It's an artifact of racism. It's an artifact of the imposition of white supremacy and how we're supposed to think of ourselves as separate and how we're supposed to think of ourselves as us and them. And we three right here on the screen right now are a testament to the myth that it is us and them, or the myth that there are Black people and Jewish people. We've always been here. We will always be here, and the Jewish community in the U.S. will continue to realize not only its potential, but its reality and its promise of being multiracial. And then within that context, because we're in the United States, we have to understand and appreciate that we were raised on white supremacy. Like the cereal we eat, the air that we breathe, the structures that we've been embedded into, were designed to keep us separate. We're designed to segregate people. We're designed to stratify people based on race. And it is our responsibility as a Jewish community, it's our responsibility as Black folks, it's a responsibility as people who care about their neighbors, our citizens, our friends, that we not only dismantle these systems that are designed to separate us and stratify us, but that we reallocate and we restructure in ways that everyone can thrive. And not only now, but when we're long gone and who we are so narrow that we can't even imagine who's coming after us. And the way we reimagine and the way we rebuild has to be expansive enough for the future. It's not about us right now. It's about everyone who's coming and dismantling this history that's kept us apart. And I will end by saying, given the audience of JCPA and the JCRC community, why do we have to do this? Why is this important? Why is this now? Because the JCRCs, and I'm sitting here with somebody who was a JCRC director in the San Francisco Bay Area for a number of years, the JCRCs have a critical role in holding community relations in this country. And for so long, the JCRCs have understood their work as Black and Jewish, as us and them, and have, despite good intentions, reinforced some of the systems that are now important for us to dismantle, interrogate, and restructure. And so the JCRCs have a very, very important role in ensuring that Black Lives Matter. That might be education. It might be rethinking the community's racism and the way that we perpetuated white supremacy, how we understand ourselves as Jews, how we navigate anti-Semitism. We have to look at all of this, and we have to look at this through new lenses and using new tools. And this moment invites all of that to happen.
You have anything to add to that, Yavilah?
Yeah, well, there's a way in which, as a leader, I'm interested in us holding the history of where we've been, the potential of the present, but also 7 generations into the future. I want any equity that we're holding to hold me and my family 7 generations into the future. And in order to work for that today, I have to be paying attention to the fact that this country, 7 generations back, was founded on the genocide of its indigenous population, that it built its wealth through the brutal subjugation of Black slave labor, that it perpetuated wealth through hundreds of millions of lifetimes over the violence and expropriation of immigrant labor. That's where we come from. The present of where we are is that we as a Jewish institutional community came into a country that set up its systems based on that. And when it set up systems based on that, we were called to be able to interact with policies from a place of equity. So I walk among many people in my leadership circles, from the federations to the JCRCs to foundations, who assume that most policies in this country are neutral, are race silent. But the real truth is that policies are actually killing people and have been killing people for a long time. I mean, Black Lives Matter itself was a grassroots movement that coalesced around the extrajudicial killing of Black people, and it received really high profile attention in 2014 through 2016. But honestly, Black people have been being killed since the start of this country. We know this. NAACP itself was founded on trying to stop the lynching of Black bodies. So this recent spate of like high profile murders that we've seen around Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd have brought our nation's attention and our attention to the need for systems change. And it's systems change that I really am about in this moment. We got to figure out what people we're talking to and what people we're not talking to. I feel like we've got to move beyond letters and statements and signing off on things and figure out who's on the front lines of these issues. Figure out how can people who are directly targeted by the issues like criminal justice, like voting registration, how do those people get to have ownership of the political struggles that are impacting their lives? If I bring it into the Jewish community, I hear a lot, especially around JCPA, about coalitions with the civil rights movement. But what's concerning to me is that the civil rights movement gave us a top-down, male-centered, charismatic model for leadership. It told us that politically, we had to rely on saviors. And it left out people who were low income, who were working class, and who were women. And as somebody who comes from a working class background, as a woman, as someone who understands the need for the people on the ground who are being directly targeted by issues like COVID, by issues of water and pollution and climate change and incarceration, I really would like to see in this moment us pay attention to who we are and who we are not in relationship with, and who can be empowered by all of this frenzy we're in right now around investing toward change. Who will this moment bring us into deeper relationship with is my question. And that's why it's so important to me to be able to be on this call and be able to talk to people about what does that entail?
Yeah. How do other people get involved? How do other people in the community get involved? How can they help? What is it that they can do? I've heard this question over and over again. With, COVID-19, a lot of people don't want to be out there, picketing and protesting because out of fear of, COVID. What is it that they can do that can help? What can be done? Ilana, if you don't mind.
I think the first thing that folks can do is make a conscious decision to move from their space of comfort into one of discomfort, and not in a spirit of they're giving something up, but Black and brown people in this country live in a space of discomfort all of the time, and comfort in this climate is a luxury, and this is not an environment where luxury and equity can intersect and align in a way that supports centering Black and brown lives. Once we decide that we're comfortable moving into discomfort, then it's time to take action. And that action means, what am I willing to give up? What am I willing to learn? And what am I willing to contribute to make sure that I halt the perpetuation of racism and white supremacy in this country? We have to think critically about not only where we are, but what we are doing to reinforce what Yavilah was saying, these non-neutral policies and practices that perpetuate racism. You can't just decide that, like, I'm not racist and that's enough, when our behaviors and our culture are designed to reinforce not only racism, but the belief that the policies and practices are okay and they're not racist. And so let me go a little bit further. What you can do is take it on your own, meet with other white folks to really understand history. For those who are white and Jewish, or white presenting, or however you self-identify with European background, to really grapple with the duality of identity around, we all understand through history that Jews from Europe were not categorized as white when they came to this country. Nevertheless, there has been a passive and sometimes not so passive falling into the privilege of whiteness that has been experienced by Jews of European background. And that needs to be interrogated, because the other loss of that is Jewish ethnic identity. And when you don't understand your own Jewish history around Jewish ethnic identity, and that there's been a passive falling into whiteness that has heaped upon you a lot of privilege, which is unearned. Privilege is something that is unearned. Then we have to also ask ourselves, what are we doing on a daily basis to perpetuate racism, and also not understand ourselves as diverse people? One of the losses of assimilation is that white ethnic identity has been blurred. And that's also a cost of racism and white supremacy. The other things that you can do are to make sure that you are willing to risk and willing to apportion resources in a way to create equity. whatever resources we have had heaped upon us in this country, a number of those resources come from unearned privilege. You just got them because you were white, or you just got them because you were male. And it's not because like somebody sent you something in the mail that said, Mazel Tov, you're white and male, let me send you a check. That's not how it works. But privilege is an unearned accumulation of resource based simply on the fact that you fit into a category that sits at the top of a hierarchy in this country. And folks have to really grapple with that, interrogate that, and then understand, what do you have to let go of? What do you have to reallocate from your own personal resource bank? And I'm not talking just about money, but what do you have to reallocate and reapportion to actually advance equity? Because other people who have not had that unearned privilege are being subjugated at your while you enjoy those privileges. If you can't march, then you should be writing letters. You should be picking up a phone. You should be looking at what your allies need from you and plugging in there. You should be liberating people from being charged and put in jail because they've been protesting. You should be thinking about the fact that in the Jewish community, of course, Black and brown people are disproportionately affected by COVID because we live in the United States and these are parallel structures. I'll end by saying we need to see people of color, Black folks, brown folks, just as us, and dissolve this kind of fictive container we put around the Jewish community, that the Jewish community is somehow separate. We're not separate. We're all we're part of an organism, we're part of an ecosystem, and we need to see ourselves as part of the greater good and embrace the opportunity to be part of the movement.
Well, I'm going to take one quick question before we continue with that. What is the first step we need to take, especially when we don't have Jews of color among our current membership? Anybody want to take this one?
Sure. There's a way in which, in my speaking about racial equity these days, I'm asking people to consider racial equity as a call to embodiment. There's a way that in this country, our bodies felt directly impacted by the need to eliminate anti-Semitism and the need to create a democracy that could hold the equity of humanity in the civil rights movement. I think that embodiment is what led us to do things in JCPA, like found the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. That wasn't necessarily something that we felt directly targeted by. It's something that we felt we were implicated in creating, not just for the Jewish community, but for all people in America who needed equity at that time. It was in our bodies. Brown versus the Board of Education, all the 1968 legislation that we partnered powerfully to create. Those were policies that brought us together in our bodies because we felt implicated in our bodies by the hatred and bigotry that was running like waves across our country. As we move from 1968, there is a gap that takes us to 1994. There are many bills and lots of different things that we're signing on. But what I have a question about is what happened to our embodiment? Where do we see ourselves embodied in the need for racial injustice? You don't need people of color around to talk about the way in which racial injustice causes white bodies and Black bodies to experience their humanity in different ways in our systems, structures, and in our institutions. What about police brutality? How does a white body experience police, and how does a Black body experience police? Criminal justice reform. How does a white body stand in front of a judge, and how does a Black body stand in front of a judge? If I went across the full rubric of asks that are coming out of movement spaces right now, there is a call for people to embody whiteness in a way that calls out to the need for justice. Voting rights suppression. How in the same city that George Floyd, that Ahmaud Arbery was killed, did they, on the one hand, feel empowered in a white body to follow somebody in a truck and gun them down and say that that was protecting their rights, but also at the same time try to arrest a Black woman who tried to help another Black person to use an electronic voting machine, and that wasn't their right. There's a way that we're not understanding equity in our bodies and how our bodies show up in the world. And I would love for embodiment to show up in Jewish spaces around immigrant justice, around economic justice, around LGBTQIA justice, around environmental justice, around healthcare, around government corruption, around education, and around common sense gun laws. Rather than sign papers, I would love for all of us to start having conversations. Where are our bodies implicated by these issues? As white folks, as Jews, as brown folks, as indigenous folks, as the full diversity of who we are as a community, where are our bodies implicated by the need for justice in these issues? And you don't need any people of color around to start that conversation.
Good, good, good. Okay. So there's another question. There are a ton of questions about whether or not the Black Lives Matter movement is an anti-Israel or anti-Semitic concept or movement.
Is that like a yes or no question, Lamar? Like, can you give us a little bit more context for what kind of questions are coming in around that?
That's just what I got. Is it? I guess it is yes or no. Is it?
Okay.
Is it an anti-Israel or anti-Semitic movement? I mean, yeah.
Well, as the audience knows and our colleagues know out there, like, I don't work for the Black Lives Matter movement, and so I can't take a policy position on behalf of them. All of the things I've read about the Black Lives Matter movement, all the engagements I've had with the Black Lives Matter movement, there is no evidence out there to suggest that the Black Lives Matter movement as a movement is either anti-Semitic nor anti-Zionist. There's nothing in their policy papers. There's nothing in the position papers. There's nothing in their charter. There's no policy. The Black Lives Matter movement is first of all, it's the most successful movement in the United States history. So let's just pause there. Second of all, in the current expression of the Black Lives Matter movement, it's full of white folks, it's full of Jews, it's full of diverse people of all kinds. And so what I would say is it's not only being documented as one of the nation's largest historical movements ever, but by far the most diverse movement ever. So we could also reframe the question and wonder what makes the Black Lives Matter movement so successful? How is it that the Black Lives movement has galvanized a nation to focus on equity and justice? How has the Black Lives Matter movement been the only movement in US history to successfully bring together people of color, people of different racial, ethnic backgrounds, people of different religious backgrounds, including all of the cohorts of Jews out there who are active in the Black Lives Matter movement? And how is it that the Black Lives Matter movement has been able to do this in a context that has so many racist headwinds trying to push it down? So I also just want to invite the audience, when they're asking that question, to ask a different question, which is, how is the Black Lives Matter movement the most successful movement in US history, the most inclusive movement in US history, and doing more in US history than any other movement combined, more than the civil rights movement, technically speaking, and we can have that historical conversation. But I'll circle back because I know what the question is and I understand what's being asked. There's no evidence to suggest that the Black Lives Matter movement is either anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist. The same way, in the Jewish community, there are racists. I'm sure there are some folks in the Black community who are anti-Semitic, but just like we don't hold the entire Jewish community accountable for the racism of the Jewish community, we can't hold the entire Black community or the entire Black Lives Matter movement accountable for anti-Semitism out there.
Yavilah, did you anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, as a Jew and as an African-American woman, what calls me into support of the Black Lives Matter movement is that it is unprecedented in my lifetime to see a grassroots organizing effort that has called so many people who are on the front lines of the issues we've been aiming to address throughout my lifetime into power around making decisions, into power in terms of articulating where our country is headed. There's a way in which, when I look at my Jewish connection to wanting to see anti-Semitism eliminated, my connection to the land of Israel, there's a way in which I know that both of those issues have been impacting the way we as Jews have been making consumer decisions, where we shop, what we buy, what we don't buy. Yes? Where can we see some affinity in terms of Black Lives Matter organizing people on the front lines to take power to do the same thing? How can alliance with Black Lives Matter help us to change and prioritize our work plans around what we're doing with our consumer power here in this country? That's a powerful question that we should very easily understand from the way in which we organize political power as Jews around these same issues. Where's volunteering come up? Where do we give freely of our time? There are people across this country who are not being paid to be a part of BLM. They are so called to that cause that they are volunteering their time, their energy, their sweat, and their tears to try to move our country forward in terms of equity. Where are we prioritizing our ability to volunteer, our ability to get out into the street? When you hold Israel and anti-Semitism in those same ways, doesn't it call you into alliance around people who are trying to do the same thing around racial equity? Think about the idea of philanthropy. How has Israel and anti-Semitism dominated our attention around charitable contributions? Are we willing to give that same attention to the way in which BLM needs our money, needs our philanthropy, needs our support? There's such a large both and to be held in this moment. And I think the only way we're going to get there is to, instead of just looking at names and terms and things, sound bites that we read in the news, where are we balancing those things with actual experience and relationships on the ground with people who are experiencing the need for equity? Where are we claiming the need to not just run real quick and do something, but slow down? COVID shut down our entire planet, and yet we still decided that we had to run out into the streets and do something, right? What is it that we're going to slow down and listen to Mother Earth and the universe itself telling us to sit down, claim your behavior, and make a difference? When are we going to stop resisting, shaming, and engaging in power plays with other groups who are equally targeted by the real need in our bodies for justice, and start engaging in how we can bring our bodies to the cause of equity ourselves? There's so much more that we can do than parse out words and politics based on sound bites. I would love to see people be more deeply involved in the work of embodying the need for justice. In the same way you sat in your house and worried about whether a pandemic, a virus that you could not see, was going to have an impact on your and your family's bodies, was going to infect you, was going to do things that you had no control over. That is the way I relate to racism and white supremacy continuing unchanged in this country. It has the power to infect and create situations where me and my family and my generations to follow are no longer safe. It is that that calls me into relationship with Black Lives Matter. And this is the most powerful movement we have seen, like I said, in my lifetime, that is lifting up an opportunity for us really to engage in system change on issues that have been with us for 300 years. It is only resilience and relationships that allows me to even be here sitting in front of you today. So that is why it is super important for us to be working on this right now and not over-focusing on a few words, a few ideas, as opposed to the depth and breadth of the opportunity of this moment.
And I just want to add, I mean, right on, Yavilah, and let me just add this. Like, if you're a scholar of Jewish US history, if you're a scholar of the history of the JCRCs, if you're a scholar of the history of the ADLs, we could ask these same questions about when the ADLs and the JCRCs targeted the Black Power movement, okay? And this is like documented history. And we don't, the same way that we get to ask critical questions of the history of the JCRCs and the ADLs as related to racial justice and reinforcing racism and white supremacy and trying to dismantle Black power in this country, the Jewish community should be asking questions about where anti-Semitism lurks across the country and in our world. But to Yavilah's point, we don't let those questions stop us from engaging in the work that is right and just. We use that information to inform us and to build coalitions and to build partnerships. But we can't, you know, the JCRC taught me to do the replacement test. And when we look at the history of the ADLs and the JCRCs, we should bring that the same spirit of inquiry with which you all have asked that question around Black Lives Matter movement. I want to embrace that same history of inquiry with the history of the JCRCs and the ADLs. To Yavilah's point, how do we focus on moving forward in the future, and what tools do we need, and where do we need to locate ourselves to actually do the work that matters, which means partnerships, coalitions, and resilience.
Got a couple more questions. Okay. Which one do I start with? All right. So, not that this one really matters. I mean, I guess it is a question though. Can we talk more about our personal experience of being Black within the Jewish community? I think in highlighting that, I don't know if that, I'm gonna skip over that one. I don't think it's necessary, because then it kind of goes against what we're trying to talk about, more of the inclusion, as far as really homing on the exclusion, or yeah, we're gonna skip that one. Do you guys mind? Do you guys want to answer that one? Okay, good. How do we keep the momentum of the movement going? And I think we've addressed this a couple of times in so many different ways. But again, the question is still coming up: how do we keep the momentum going? I think we talked about, writing letters, speaking out, doing the research, just being present, standing up, and noticing things going on, and noticing, like you mentioned before, where the white privilege is coming into place, and kind of dismantling some of those things. So I don't know how else we can answer that question either.
I mean, I would just add, and for those of you who've worked with me, I'm always going to push back and reframe your questions. And so I'm just, thank you for inviting me into this collegial conversation. The momentum is not the issue, because this country will continue to marginalize and kill Black and brown people until we dismantle the systems that perpetuate the killing of Black and brown people. Like, that is the source of the momentum, is the violence, and the marginalization of Black and brown folks in this country. Like, it's constantly happening all of the time, on a moment by moment, day to day, week to week, year to year, century to century, lador vador, generation to generation basis in this country, okay? And so the question is not how do we keep the momentum going, it's how do you all stay awake? How do you stay conscious? How do you move from a space where you were not awake to what was happening around you, where you cannot go to sleep because you can't turn the sounds off, you can't turn the sights off. The bell has been rung, and as one of my colleagues said to me who works for the URJ, the bell has been rung and now I can't get the sound out of my head. That's what it sounds like to us all of the time. And so how do you keep the sound in your head, knowing that until we uplift all of us together, that momentum of violence will not stop? And it's easy for people who are not part of a community that is marginalized to turn the sound off, or to close your eyes, or to go back into your house. And so how do we keep the momentum of activism going? How do we keep the momentum of consciousness going? And how do we keep the momentum of those who enjoy the benefits of privilege, dipping their toes into taking risks and truly learning how to be allies, and coming to terms with the cost of inaction, what that cost is, not only for Black and brown folks, but for white folks in this community, because Black and brown folks, if you don't have Black and brown folks in your family yet, you're one grandbaby or one baby niece away from having one. And so this is not an entirely an intellectual exercise. And so how do we all stay awake, I think is a different and differently important question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was struggling with that one.
Well, I mean,
you got something else? Go ahead.
There's a way in which, as a leader, a Jewish woman of color leader who's been in this work for almost over 20 years. I mean, I started the work of organizing Jews of color in 1997. So here we are 23 years later, and I'm finding that, kind of like, just to give a nod to the question we didn't answer, there's a way in which I've experienced that my leadership has been tokenized and objectified, as if when I show up in spaces, the most powerful thing I can do is tell somebody my story. And what that does is make it seem as if my story had some magic making element to it. By hearing my story, all of a sudden people will be changed. And immediately now people will come to some understanding that's going to change my experience in systems that I have to leave telling my story to go back into every day. And there's a way in which what would be good is to keep the momentum would be for us to start thinking as a community about solutions where our community are responsible and feel accountable to develop strategies that empower people to actually experience change. Systems change for us as JOCs means that we get to lead outside of dominant, hierarchical, self-aggrandizing models for leadership that says that somebody somewhere else gets from a top-down place to tell us what we need, and then ask us to sit there and sign off on those things as if they were our ideas in the first place. Momentum would look like us sitting together and thinking about how can we change our decision-making strategies right now to evoke deeper consideration of equity from the beginning. Momentum would look like fostering active engagement and empowerment of diversity within our stakeholders. I know lots of JOCs who have lots of resource. I know lots of JOCs who have wisdom, who have leadership capacity. How come those people have not been at tables of stakeholders in ways that have mattered to my life is a question that I would love to see more momentum put behind. There are funders who are already thinking about that. I want to see more thought about that. I want to see more strategy about that. I want when I come to a table for people to stop asking me about my story and ask me what I know about that. I want people to pay some attention to disparities. We're in COVID-19, and a lot of our policies right now are following the country around trying to be responsive to the pandemic. But how are we being responsive to the pandemic and not understanding that 75% of essential workers in this country that went to work anyway during COVID 24/7 and did not stop were people of color? How are you not considering whether that's my uncle, my nephew, my niece, the people who are in my family who have not yet received rest, and yet we are talking about how to help people to go to camp? There's a way in which right now I want people to build momentum beyond COVID by thinking about inequities and disparities that don't just live within the Jewish community, but beyond the Jewish community in terms of who gets to have and who doesn't get to have. Things as essential as breath, water, services in this country. If we are thinking about impacts, and that's what we do as policymakers, then how are those impacts helping us to center those who have been most deeply disadvantaged by inequitable policies historically? That's where I think there's so much work to do that it'll keep us busy for the next 100 years if we choose.
So another question, as a Jewish professional, I guess this would be a non-Jew of color. How can I push my organization to see that this is bigger than just the inclusion of Jews of color, but we need to commit to the abolishment of racial injustice overall? So I guess within his community, I don't know, there's some questions about whether his attempt or his communication is about bringing people, Jews of color, inward, and he wants to more focus on racial injustice overall. Yeah. So I mean, I think we kind of hit on that a couple of times, that we need to look at what's going on just as people, as individuals, like humanity, as a whole. Like, we're looking at racial injustice, but I mean, if we take, yes, there is separation because people of color are being more targeted in these situations. But if you look at it as human beings or individuals that are being targeted as like just overall, does that make sense? Am I making sense with that? So yeah.
Ilana, I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say about this too, but I'll just go personal right now because I think sometimes that helps people to ground themselves. When COVID-19 hit, I live in Newton, Massachusetts. Newton, Massachusetts is a predominantly white suburb, where a lot of Jewish people live here in Boston. When COVID-19 hit, there everything shut down. And we all had to figure out how to get groceries. Yes? So there were these new ways in which we had to move through grocery stores. I'm sure people across the country experienced this too, you know, social distancing, 6 feet apart. They put up plexiglass. They did all these things to help us be able to navigate a historic moment around what it means to be Americans, used to having liberty and the ability to move around as we'd like. And now we can't get our groceries, right? Because we're worried about going to a supermarket and getting COVID-19. So my first trip into the supermarket was very interesting. The reason why it was interesting is because whereas the day before the country shut down, I was able to go into what we call a star market and see a diverse array of workers who were cashiers and people who were working the register. And then all of a sudden, the day after COVID-19, the people who were behind the register became majority folks who are from Africa, people who are from Latinx communities. People of color were now the cashiers. People of color were now putting boxes on shelves. And immediately, as a woman in a Black body, it brought tears to my eyes that in my community, while people were so worried about whether there was flour where we could be baking, or whether we were able to find yeast, or whether all the toilet paper had been out of the store, what was most salient on my mind is, why don't the people who have to risk their bodies to serve us, why in that are Black bodies still on sacrifice? Why is it that Black and brown and indigenous bodies are the ones that we rely on to be able to give us essential service, yet 2 weeks, 3 months, a year before, our policies didn't value them enough to pay them a living wage? These are the kind of things that bring us into a life consideration. There is a life that you are benefiting the resources of right now. And how does it make you feel as a human to know that that resource that you may be experiencing is not shared across the common humanity that you share with folks right in your village, right in your community, right in your grocery store? That's why I came home that night and I couldn't sleep at night. I couldn't sleep at night because I could see with my own 2 eyes, and I don't know if everybody else saw the same, but I could see with my own 2 eyes how my humanity was on sale, how my humanity was being commoditized because of the kind of body that I was in, because of the class of the people, that they didn't feel the leisure not to work. And their white coworkers may have felt had families, resources, bank accounts that allowed them to stay out of a store and preserve their bodies, while those who look like me could not. So that's an example of just on a very like everyday, just human thing. What are you seeing around you that's calling your humanity into question? Do you want to be a human where you get things that other people do not in this country simply based on the amount of melanin in your skin? How does that help you to sleep at night?
Beautiful. And I just would add to that, when you are invited to hold those questions, and this circles directly back to the person who asked the question, Lamar. When you're invited to hold those questions that Yavilah just offered, you have a framework to think about and understand those questions that doesn't require people of color to be around you to have this conversation. Go pick up How to Be an Anti-Racist, and then think about Yavilah and read it and reflect on it. Don't just put it under your pillow, and think about Yavilah's questions in that context. Every organization in the Jewish community was established on a context that we know is racist, not because there are people in there who are wearing white hoods actively advocating racist policies, but there is a passive support of racist policies going on all of the time in a context where every organization established in the United States has racism and white supremacy in its DNA. And if we get fragile at just reckoning with that reality, then we can't understand and hold Yavilah's question. Because there's a reason why there are only Black and brown people in our grocery stores right now. There's a reason why the Jews of Color Initiative had to establish our own COVID-19 relief fund for individuals. And there are a bunch of Jews of color professionals who did not have access to Jewish community resources that everybody else did because they are Black and brown. And they have a direct headwind that is even pushing them out of the Jewish community, getting support from the Jewish community. The data is here. This is all real. And every one of these stories has a policy wrapped around it that perpetuates this kind of inequity. And every one of these policies have people just like us and just like you on this webinar who by culture, by beliefs, by passive engagement, perpetuate these policies. And what you can do about it right now is have consciousness that of course our organizations are racist. Of course they perpetuate white supremacy because we are here in the US, full stop. And therefore, what do we get to do about it? How lucky are we that we get to explore that question and we have that story that Yavilah just offered us to help guide us through thinking about that question. How lucky are we?
Yeah.
Is there any resources? So people they can contact directly so that they can start having these conversations more actively. Maybe people that are in place that they can contact within your personal organizations or any other organizations to kind of help. Do you have any information like that, resources for them?
I'm gonna let Yavilah take this. Let me just say one thing, and then you can have the whole answer. The JCRC should be the people at the other side of the phone to pick up the call when our community needs help, right? The Jewish Community Relations Councils across this country who are in the business of community relations, who are in the business of holding this space, who are in the business of having resources available, people power, dollar power, federation power, the national Jewish community power. Like the JCRCs are exactly who we should be able to pick up and call and say, who do we go to? Where do we get help? We need diversity training. We need to explore how to be anti-racist. We want to explore how to move our practices and policies. So I want to set a goal, which is every JCRC in this country should be that resource for the Jewish community. And with that, I'll let Yavilah take the rest of the answer, but there's something wrong in this country when the JCRCs can't answer this question themselves. And I'm not saying you all out there have a lack of resources, a lack of tools, a lack of vision, but I'm saying let's transform our own Jewish community to have a whole blanket and network of resources so that we're not always relying on Jews of color and Black and brown Jews to provide the resources that should be, that should transcend racial boundaries in this country, but we're not there yet.
So amen to Sister Ilana. That makes 100% sense. Yeah. And then there's another piece of this, which is to invest right now in Black and brown communities' capacity to serve themselves. If we know we're coming from a history of inequity, equity in this moment should be about reparation. You know, right now, I am the only African-American CEO of an organization that's providing direct service to Jews who happen to be Jews of color. And we have had to fight to find resources to be able to support ourselves, because what people are most used to is signing us up as Jews of color to be in service to white majority institutions. That pattern has to change. Folks within those institutions are just as magical as any Jew of color you're gonna find. With a little consciousness, with a little bit of awareness, with a little bit of education, how could our entire professional community be prepared to address inequity simply by seeing our community of Jews of color as a historically under-resourced place to now invest? So what I would like to do is I would like to see, not that Dimensions had to create, like Ilana, our own mental health network to help people deal with being triple threat under COVID, racism, and the possibility of being killed for just running to take a jog in your community. We don't have to be the ones to create a mental health network to help people to deal with that reality. They are federations, they are synagogues, they are institutions, they are JCRCs, they are JCPAs, they are social justice organizations that are just as concerned about our condition of being triple threat under our systems as Dimensions is. How are we creating capacity in the context of COVID-19 response to be able to deal with people who actually are losing people in their families? I've been having conversations with people all week who essentially came through COVID and didn't necessarily feel strained. Went to a house out in the Cape. Were a little bit inconvenienced by feeling a little bit of cabin fever, but didn't lose people in their family. Like I lost my mother. Like my admin almost lost her sister who was in ICU in Michigan. Like my national JOC organizer who had to leave Washington, DC because there were 1,000 cases of COVID within a 10-block radius of the Black community in Washington, DC. 1,000 cases erupted, and she had a newborn whose life she had to protect. We're Jews. We're in the community. We're experiencing disparity. And yet in the context of our responsiveness, it was a real haul to see our Jewish institutions focus on how are those disparities playing out directly in our community, and where are we accountable to invest in JOC communities to make sure they don't come to harm in this moment. So all I'm going to say is rely on us to be at the table with you as brilliant, as capable, as badass leaders, excuse my French, but please also rely on yourselves to be the same brilliant, capable, badass leaders who are capable of holding equity in this moment in partnership with us. That doesn't make us work so hard that we become exhausted, that we experience our triple threat as an opportunity to go under the water, or that we see that the future is not anything but an invitation for us to continue to work hard. Give us rest, give us community, give us space to be ourselves. And I think that will take our community to a different place.
Good, good. Keep in mind, these questions are coming from the public, not from the JCRC. So I had to let that disclosure come out there. So the questions that we're answering are coming directly from people within the public. Any closing remarks? I'm starting to wrap it up. Any closing remarks, anything you guys want to share in addition to?
I want to offer that, you know, I mentioned that I was part of a JCR team for a number of years. And the one personal piece I will share is it becomes really awkward to do Black Jewish breakfasts and Black Jewish things in a context where it presupposes there are no Black Jews. And when we have created models that are really based on our national structure of separation, our national structure of segregation, our national structure of creating us and them, so we never realize our true purpose and future is to be us as a collective, then we are doing damage in the name of good. And that damage results in hurting the Jewish community in all of its own diversity, and then harming our larger community, both with practices and policies, but also because we are stealing from ourselves the opportunity to be in partnership. We're stealing from ourselves the opportunity to be in relationship, and we're stealing from ourselves the opportunity to be part of a movement that is not just trying to save the lives of Black people, but understands that we're trying to save the lives of our neighbors and our friends and our humans. And that's what this whole moment and movement is all about. And so I appreciate that there are JCRC colleagues out there. I appreciate that there are community colleagues out there. Every one of us has to not only stop in this moment, slow down. Yavilah is telling, we have to stop and slow down in this moment and really understand that this situation is not only bigger than us, it demands of us to be in partnership and relationship. There's a reason why babies die when they're not held. There's a reason why big people die when they're not held. It's because it is not our nature to be alone. And as we try to move through this moment, whatever we do has to bring us closer together rather than reinforcing our separation. Our future is diverse. We're already here. Our future is about partnership, and our future is about ensuring that those 7 generations have a planet that is thriving, has people around it that are thriving, and that these boundaries of race, they're all important to understand. And every one of our futures is going to be bigger and more expansive than us. And so until we learn how to be together, we are halting our own progress. And I want to choose progress, and I want to choose relationship, and I want to choose that my 7th generation is thriving and alive and is alongside your 7 generations. And that's what this moment is an invitation to.
Amen. Amen. Salam. I want to end on a note of speaking directly to JOCs, because that's the work that I do. I empower and uplift JOC and POC communities because we need each other's love, and we need each other's hugs, and we need each other's support. And I'm going to speak to them for the last 5 minutes, because I don't want to be on a call that feels as if I'm only speaking to white majority institutions. I'm also speaking to us. And so to every JOC out there who hasn't heard it, let me tell you that your Blackness is beautiful. Let me tell you that you are strong. Let me tell you that you are sufficient, that your humanity matters, that you are allowed to resist perfectionism as a model for your value, that you are able to be in process in community, that you are able to experience yourself in love with other people without having to serve or do another thing. You were worthy and valuable from the day that you were born. I welcome you to speak your own truth. I welcome you to engage in healing for yourself and for the sake of our broader community. And I welcome you to not apologize, not another day, not to retranslate, not another day, the beauty of your Jewish existence. You are what Jewish looks like. And every day that we work for equity, we're working for you to have space to know everything that I just said.
Amen. Thank you all for attending the webinar. If you enjoyed the webinar or want to support JCPA's important work on equity and civil rights, please consider making a donation. To donate or learn more about JCPA's work, please visit the website, jewishpublicaffairs.org. Ladies, I appreciate everything that you have shared. Brilliant, the women in our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Lamar. Thank you, Yavilah.
Thank you, Lamar.
Thank you.